All right, shall we start?
Okay. Well, let's start. You're all very welcome to this launch event of the EU Integration and Citizens' Rights Research Programme that we're launching this morning. It's a hybrid event, so we're here in the room and we have an online audience as well. My name is Paul Gillespie. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the School of Politics and International Relations in University College Dublin, and I direct a project on constitutional futures after Brexit. I'm also been for many years a journalist with the Irish Times, and I'm still writing for that paper. Now, this project explores and researches ways to address the EU's legitimacy crisis, particularly through the optimal activation of citizens' rights. The question of legitimacy looms large in the social sciences, and it can be broadly perhaps defined as the EU's acceptability to its citizens. And this project will look at that subject within the EU, in the EU's neighbourhood, and at a global level. It's very much interdisciplinary, particularly between law and political science, but with a big dose of sociology as well, I think. And the work programmes will be outlined by the speakers. Now, we're tight for time. We have a little over an hour, and the speakers are committed to maximum 7 minutes. I have a little thing here that I'll put up that there's 2 minutes to go. That will give us time for a discussion afterwards and questions and answers. And our first, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Dagmar Sheik, who's our Synod Family Chair of EU Law here in UCC. She's John Monnet Chair in EU Law as well. And her work has been particularly on rights to do with comparative labour law and social rights within the EU setting, directly enforceable rights. And she will give us an overview of the research programme, which she directs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. And I like that you said us here, because that was a very good tune. And I'm delighted to present our research program. I don't quite know where to look. That camera will get me right.
Oh, that's
that one. All right. Need to look to everybody there. And although the mood in the EU is a bit somber, since this week we have 4 member states where we have parliaments governed by majorities, which are not exactly in tune with the EU's values, which might not implement especially mobility rights for EU citizens and others. Some might have a skepticism for protecting minorities, and they also might not run with all the economic projects of the EU, especially in the field of state aid. So, well, how can the EU continue in this? And of course, this isn't really new. And continuing the sober tone here, we have had a series of crises, from the economic crisis in 2008, which wasn't caused in the EU, I am prone to say, but with the EU managed in ways which gained the perception of a promoter of austerity, especially in southern EU member states. The increase in refugees following the Arab Spring in 2015 and the wars coming from that has also demonstrated that the EU was not able to agree on a common asylum policy and common migration policy, common border management policy in solidarity. And on the global pandemic, initially the EU was also portrayed as incompetent when the UK engaged in vaccine nationalism, but it gained some appreciation when it managed to govern the vaccination issue and the also even the movement issues to a limited extent. And with the war in Ukraine, the EU emerges again as a beacon of hope in global matters. But what will this really do for improving the perception of the EU with its citizens, especially in those member states I mentioned earlier, but all the other ones which are EU skepticism? And that is where we come in. So we want to look into the question how EU-derived rights can actually enhance its legitimacy. How can citizens be enabled to interact through rights? That's our hypothesis. So what we are really doing, as Paul has said in 15 minutes, because he said it already, which is great. So the project is to restate the connection between the citizens and the EU through rights. And that, of course, means we are not having a legalistic approach of rights. The yellow bit here is not what I invented. That's our esteemed successors who assess the application for getting us funding. So we make the case for non-legalistic interdisciplinary approach to understand citizens' rights and the sociological, although none of us is a sociologist. We need to get them on board. So, of course, all this means we have three basic concepts: rights, activation, and legitimacy. And as I said, rights are not a legalistic approach, but we do have lawyers. Half of our PIs are lawyers. And that means we also look into the question whether rights are directly effective and enforceable. But we do realize that not all citizens have the capacity to go to court all the time. And even legal scholars do look at rights from a more normative perspective, so they inform interaction without always being litigated. And we draw on political science projects such as the age-old integration through law project, which actually derived a political integration theory from the direct effectiveness of EU rights. Now, that project was also criticized because the EU rights that were protected were mainly economic rights. And there's a wide array of scholars who say, well, promoting those economic rights with priority, directly effective, destroys other rights at national levels, be they social rights or cultural rights. Now, in addition, the EU creates rights to instruments such as directives, which aren't necessarily directly enforceable, and even the Charter of Fundamental Rights has limited direct effects. This is where political and sociological conceptions of rights come in. Rights can be used as argument. At the moment, current relevant Ukraine demands that Russia is dragged before an international court of justice, which Russia doesn't even have to recognize. Still, this is a powerful moral argument, and so rights which are not enforceable at all can still be used in political discourse and can create what Nash calls a culture of rights. And that's what we look in as well. So how can rights then be activated? By activation, we look into the area of how the EU, with its rights within and without, creates opportunity structures. And these can be legal opportunity structures for litigation, to argue with rights. They can be political opportunity structures. We even look into one area without preempting what Steve's going to say, how citizens can create their own rights. Okay. So our activation studies are basically focused on social movements, and we are not only focused on social movements, we also want to identify how individual citizens can rely on EU rights through activating them in interaction with the EU and interaction with each other. I think the most difficult link is our link to legitimacy, and here we have to distinguish normative versions of the legitimacy, how are the institutions set up, are they properly democratic and so on, that's institutionalized, and then perceptive, perceiving legitimacy, which is also sometimes called legitimation, how the EU is perceived. And I've already reverted to this. These are two different strands of legitimacy studies, really. And we sit somewhere in between again, yeah? So we don't promote new institutions, and we look into the perception, actually, but we also want to look in the practical legitimation via processes to which citizens can actually engage with their EU rights. Now, what makes us special? Said already, we don't have a legalistic approach to rights. We look into activating rights where we build opportunity structures, but also look to develop the basis for relational concepts of rights. And the range of our geographical coverage also makes us special. And we are not only looking for rights in the Union, and that's not rights of EU citizens only. We also look into the EU neighbourhood. Now, the EU neighbourhood is 27 neighbours, so we look into the far west and the far east. The far west is Northern Ireland, our perception, which is still a neighbour of the EU, right, isn't it? Do we have anything more western in the neighbourhood? No, I don't think so. And the Far East, it's not really the Far East we're looking at Ukraine. As we compare, especially in the rights in the Union, the rights in the EU neighbourhood, we have an overlap because we look into movement rights for citizens. Free is inverted in brackets because it's not really free movement in the neighbourhood, neither Northern Ireland nor in the Ukraine. And then anti-discrimination rights, which may be perceived as imposition, even in our eastern neighbourhoods as well. So that's a common issue there. However, we don't only look into free movement anti-discrimination rights, we look into social rights, human rights, especially in the EU's external relations, and economic rights. And I think I'm within my 7 minutes now. Very good. We had so much explanation. I think this is an ideal slide to guide over to the presentation of individual work packages, with which I give the floor to Stephen Coates, and I also give this here to Stephen Coates, who can then go to his own slides. Oh, I'll do that service if I can. But there, and we want all these notes out immediately.
I'm sure people will be able to make much sense of them anyway. So. Okay, thank you, Martin. This is extremely. Hopefully, there won't be a huge overlap, but I might draw on what you're saying there. Sometimes illustrating the approach, particularly, and how the different elements of this particular work package fit in with the broader project. So this is the first, I think you can say, substantive work package in the sense of focusing on a particular area, which is citizens' rights enactment in the EU. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly outline the approach of the work package and methodological scholarly approach. Secondly, then look at the specific events that are being planned. Effectively, it's a set of case studies, realistically, of the practical or the way the rights operate in practice. And then thirdly, just focus a little bit on our first event, which is largely planned at this stage, and to just a bit of a trailer of that, I suppose. So first of all, the approach. In line with the broader project, this is a study of citizenship rights, but it's citizenship in the union rather than citizenship of the union. This is a distinction which I think is a nice, neat, it's simple, but all great ideas are simple, drawn by Joe Shaw in a piece in 2021. And her point is that traditionally EU citizenship studies approached rights from a quite narrow legalistic perspective, and one that focused very much on the rights which were inherited from the internal market. So free movement of workers, free movement, freedom of residence, non-discrimination on grounds of nationality, so quite an actually specific non-discrimination ground. So this, as I said, is a kind of a legacy of the internal market origins of citizenship, and it still structures the scholarship, largely speaking, I would say, in the area. What we want to do is to move kind of beyond that and to talk about citizenship in the union. So it's a much broader experience that individuals have, and a much broader conception of the rights which they derive from union citizenship or from EU law more generally. And I think there are other people moving in this direction. A recent example is a piece by Anastasia Eliopoulos about studying data protection rights from a citizenship perspective and the way in which they can be brought together in terms of techniques and rhetoric as well, incidentally, that the language of citizenship is useful and the language of rights is useful in activating and pushing a particular development. The second approach then is it's broad and multifaceted. So as I said, we want to go beyond free movement. When we do address free movement rights, they still retain their importance, of course, but to place them also in the context of pandemic and perhaps other events which have occurred even more recently. So we look at free movement, we look at social rights, and you'll see the events in the next slide. Trying to adopt as well as sort of a law and context approach and to see how they operate in practice, and then a relatively good range of situations as well are being addressed. And then finally, an attempt as well to address the realisation of the rights in practice. So which is why we sort of take effectively a case study approach. So you can see there are the 4 events which are being planned and the relevant dates. I'll talk to the first one in a little bit more detail in the next slide, because as I said, that's largely organised. But it essentially addresses what happens when EU free movement rights are really tested in the face of a major emergency of public health concern and a certain, what people have termed epidemiological nationalism in response to that, and how that fits with the EU as I don't want to say a post-national body, but at least the nature of free movement rights in order to create a transnational space, shall we say. The Citizens Initiative is something introduced in the Treaty of Lisbon. It's effectively a form of participatory or direct democracy. It was held with great promise, but I think it's fair to say that it has experienced some difficulties in its practice, and particularly in its fit with the EU's legislative and institutional arrangements. So we're going to look at a particular example of this, and we're actually partnering with a specific initiative and the organisers of that initiative, which is Universal Basic Income, which I think at this stage has submitted signatures, and They're,
It's failed. It has
Oh,
gone
okay.
off its team.
yeah, they're engaging with the, yeah. So we'll see how, yeah, as I said, that's just an example of the difficulties experienced by this and perhaps in activating that. And I think actually that's a good example of this idea of activation, citizens activating their own rights, because the point of the ECI was to move from a passive political subject to a more active political subject in the construction of a political citizenry, really, I suppose, that participates. So the difficulties, I suppose, in achieving that activation and in achieving citizens' own ownership and active participation in the process. The third one is to look at sports. I have written down in my notes sports sans frontières, but I think we'll stick with the English version. And this is, it's actually hugely relevant to European Union studies and European Union law. Sports is the regulation of football is clearly done at the EU level, is very important in cases, but also from an identity perspective as well. There's a nice piece by Flores de Vita and Jan Zlensky recently about the importance of football, particularly to pan-European identity, as a kind of a transnational activity that people engage in and interact with. And so we're going to focus on broadcasting rights and the extent to which this is the potential is not actually fulfilled because of the ongoing sort of fragmentation of the sport broadcasting space. So it's sort of interesting where EU law itself, through exceptions and various IP, can actually impact negatively on the formation of a pan-European identity. And then fourthly, then anti-discrimination law and post-pandemic inequalities, focusing on the role that law and rights particularly can play in addressing, kind of serious societal difficulties that are addressing with emergencies, and the extent to which these were, could, should have been used to combat inequalities that were exacerbated by the pandemic. And so then finally, and I hope I'm still in the right picture, just to give a brief overview of that first event, which is planned already for, oh, no, that's the wrong date. I'm not sure where that came from.
From your side.
So for me,
Just say it.
I don't know what the 23rd means nothing to me, but it's actually the 19th of January, and hopefully
Listeners, 19th of January.
The 19th of January for everybody online. I do apologize for that. Sorry. Anyway, so that, as I said, it's planned. It will take place in UCC as it's a hybrid event. So in person, largely speaking, one of the speakers will be joining us online, and then obviously the audience can join online. So it's the pandemic, but also we want to move a little bit beyond that as well. And the pandemic was largely speaking seen as, broadly speaking, you could say maybe that the EU had a good pandemic in the sense of next generation EU, vaccine rollout, etc., joint approach to vaccination. But in the area of free movement rights, I think we can question that quite seriously. And the real test for free movement law and the European Union in enforcing that, I think, may or may not have failed. As I said, in the face of this epidemiological nationalism, which asserts national borders as a form of closure. We should not forget the symbolic nature of borders here, and the symbol and the signalling that emerges from them in terms of the state as a secure place, and this reassertion of the importance of the state as the provider of certain public goods, and clashing very significantly with the public book provided by the European Union, which of course is the transnational space. There's some countervailing tendencies to that, a common EU entry ban, which we in Ireland maybe we're not super familiar with because it's Schengen based, and certain coordination, but that can be teased out. So we have three great speakers. One, Daniel Pym, Professor Daniel Pym, is going to address Schengen, which again is something which you in Ireland are sometimes have a blind spot about. But the Schengen is going through a series of crises actually, and this will tie into that. Free movement rights then specifically, free movement of residents, it's going to be addressed by Nathan Cambion from the University of Antwerp, recently at the Court of Justice, as a referendaire, exactly. And then finally, to kind of bring things together, union citizenship and crisis. So Professor Dora Costa-Copoulou, who is a legal scholar, but also I think we could say socio-legal, and draws on extremely interesting theoretical insights to citizenship, and has a great interest in the development of citizenship on the current development and the horizon. So she will be able to, I think, draw together recent difficulties that citizenship faced and tied into the pandemic. So I think that's good with me, and pass on.
And our next speaker is Dr. Mary C. Murphy.
Myself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
First of all, this gives me the opportunity to just say that Dr. Stephen Woods is the lecturer here at the School of Law, and he also was recently elevated to the board of the Irish Centre of European Law. And I'm presenting the second work package, which is headed by myself and Dr. Mary C. Murphy. Oh, I forgot your email. Thank you for giving me that. Sorry about this. And Mary C. Murphy is a senior lecturer in the School of Government and Politics. This is a day of mistakes, and we are looking into the EU's neighbourhood and citizens' rights. And the EU neighbourhood obviously is a bit larger than just Northern Ireland and Ukraine. And it came into explicit recognition with the Treaty of Lisbon as an area where the EU creates space around itself, perhaps best characterized as a staged integration process, just short of membership. So what can the EU then offer by way of rights in this area? Thus, the EU, and of course we need to recognize that Brexit somehow disturbed or disrupts this whole process, because suddenly we have a neighbor who does want to go away from the EU rather than come in, where all the other neighborhood was initially consisting of states which said, neighborhood is fine, but we really want to be a member in the case. And that is, when we wrote this application, Ukraine actually had not issued a membership application. Well, that only happened in February this year, although with the Orange Revolution, there were already quite a few people who wanted to become member, but the governments of the day, including the Zelensky government, never applied. Also because it wasn't clear whether Ukraine is in Europe. That's one of the official explanatories. I wouldn't say that the EU was of that opinion. Now, can this neighborhood relationship create rights at all? After all, these are international agreements, aren't they? So which lack direct effect and enforceability. So in a way, our work package is the test whether we can make sense of rights in a political and sociological sense, or whether we are tied to the legal parameters. So I would say that there is quite a bit of strive for legal approximation, especially the association agreements which aim at accession, have loads of chapters, including anti-discrimination law, but including also free movement law, citizens' movement law, legislation into their national law. So there's an element of legal integration here as well. But in a way, and for especially in UK, if we look to Northern Ireland, rights, equal rights, rights for citizens were always so I was just saying while you were off how our expertise is ideally matched, and so I wouldn't go to that further. So we now, of course, have Ukraine is in a new situation. They've launched a membership application, but I think it's fair to say that migration rights and anti-discrimination rights will be some of the more difficult packages to negotiate. So we've paired with our research questions are: how do rights to movement from Northern Ireland, the UK and Ukraine compare? And how they compare to citizens' rights as well? What are the political and legal implications of the anti-discrimination acquis in these two regions? Not forgetting that these are both conflicted societies. I didn't use post-conflict for Northern Ireland because I'm not so sure whether it's relevant. I live just 5 miles south from Larne, just in case. So, yeah, in a nice little enclave, which is non-sectarian. So I think they're both conflicted societies. And how can anti-discrimination law, with ethnic proportions, with religious proportions, but also with lesbian and gay rights, have an impact on those societies? That's one of our questions. We only have 2 events here, one on citizens' free movement rights, comparing Ukraine and Northern Ireland, and one on anti-discrimination rights. You can see the months, we haven't specified the dates yet. We have partnered with LIV. Professor Oksana Golovko is written differently by her own university when it's transcribed in Latin. The university writes of its age, but she spells herself like that, so Oksana Golovko. And that's University of Lviv and Kiev Mohyla Academy. We board members Roman Petrov, but we also have contacts to civil society in Ukraine, and we are part of the Center for Cross-Border Studies via Dr. Anthony Soraj in Northern Ireland. We are presenting our project, or rather I'm presenting our project already at the Ukrainian European Studies Association in October, which revives that cooperation. So I think that's all I have to say, and I have got one in extra because I saved it earlier. And with that, I give this over to Andrew, I think. And Andrew Putt is a professor, another Germany professor in the School of Government and Politics, and he presents together with. Can I manage this, please? I'm silly. I've done it wrong. It presents together with Dr. Luigi Leonardo. Andrew's specialization is in external relations from political science perspective. And Luigi's specialization is a lecturer in law in the School of Law, and also specializes in external relations. And some people will have seen on Twitter that he has a book out soon or just yet. Anyway, Andrew, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And again, just so people can see, if people are online, Luigi, my co-conspirator in this, is sat here next to me. So I guess I'm talking on both of our behalf. So you can correct me on pieces that I get wrong, Luigi. So as Dagmar mentioned, our work package in this project looks at the global dimension of this. I guess ordinarily when one thinks about citizens' rights and the EU, one thinks about, within the EU, the member states of the EU and, citizens of EU member states. And as Dagmar has just explained, the picture is wider than that in terms of the neighbourhood, but it's also wider than that in terms of having a global element to it, and that's what we'll look at in this work package. So I'll maybe just begin with our questions, as it were. The first one, as you can see, is how does the development of rights within and by the EU impact on the EU's relations with third countries and on global rights debates? So that very clearly, again, links in with the previous work package. But if you think about it, the EU has not only political and economic relations with states in its neighbourhood, but it has political and economic relations with other countries and other regional actors around the world. And the EU plays a big role, or a significant role, in the UN, including in UN human rights issues. So the development of rights within the EU links into the EU's larger external role. That then takes me to our second question, which is really about the EU as a foreign policy actor. So over the last 30 years, the EU has made, in some ways, major steps forward in terms of developing a foreign policy. And in that context, one of the stated goals of EU foreign policy is to try to promote rights, particularly human rights, globally. So how does the Union go about this? What kind of lessons can we learn from about 30 years of EU efforts as a foreign policy actor to try and promote human rights? Third question we'll look at, and this is where Luigi has particular expertise in it, is in terms of the EU's economic role. So the EU has a wide range of economic relationships with third countries, particularly trade agreements, but also, for instance, the EU's provision of aid, the EU's support for actors in developing regions like the African Union. So again, in what ways does this impact on rights in third countries? And there are a lot of important and sensitive issues, particularly in the trade area, about how EU trade negotiations and EU trade agreements with third countries impact on rights questions in those countries. The other question which we look at is the impact of external developments on rights within the EU. So if one thinks about EU foreign policy and debates around these kinds of issues, certainly, 20, perhaps even 10 years ago, we tended perhaps to think primarily about the EU's potential to project rights externally, or the EU's potential to promote rights globally beyond its borders. But one of the things that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is the rise of authoritarian great powers, and the re-emergence of Russia and China as increasingly powerful actors at a point when those two countries are becoming more authoritarian internally, and in particular, to varying degrees, they have sought to externalize their defense of authoritarianism, if we put it like that. So again, that raises questions about how that impacts potentially on rights within the European Union. And related to that is what I've described there as techno-authoritarianism. So particularly in China, we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years the increasing use of advanced technology and the emergence of a powerful surveillance state within China. But there are elements of that that project out beyond China's borders and that spill out from China and may have an impact on the EU. So we'd like to explore that question as well. I'll say a bit more about in a moment about two of our foci in terms of the economic dimension of this and the China dimension. But maybe the first thing to note is that we will have our first event entitled EU Geopolitical Autonomy and Citizens' Rights, which will take place on the 18th of November, and we'll be sending out full details of that to anyone who's interested within certainly the next week or so.
All the events are listed on the European as well.
So secondly, then, just to say a bit more about the legal and economic dimension. As I mentioned, this is the bit where Luigi is leading. And as you can see there, there's been much debate over the EU's economic constitution, if we use that terminology. To what extent is that projected externally? So if you look at the EU's political economy, there's a kind of nexus between internal and external dimensions in terms of free movement rights, investment flows, and competition law. So all of those things impact on rights issues in third countries. And then, as mentioned, you have specifically free trade agreements, where the EU has quite often sought to include particularly human rights clauses as part of those free trade agreements. But there are other elements, data and so on, which come under those free trade agreements. One way of looking at that is in terms of regulatory convergence with third countries. So Anu Bradford has been a prominent author in this and has talked about what she calls the Brussels effect, the EU's role, as she describes it, as a global regulatory superpower. So the EU's development of regulations within the EU, given the size of the EU's market and its global economic interconnections, have a global impact, which impacts then on rights issues, and then specifically territorial extension in terms of whether conduct abroad determines the application of EU law. So again, we'll have another event on this seminar on EU trade agreements and rights. So April next year, April of 2023. So then the final area we'll look at is China, the EU, China, and human rights. My colleague, Dr. Niall Duggan, also from the Department of Government and Politics here at UCC, will join me in this, and I know that Mark Howsky and others in the law school also have a strong interest in China. So we have a number of questions here. Firstly, how has the EU sought to advance and protect human rights in China in the context of the what's referred to as the strategic partnership with China, in particular, for the best part, I think, of 15, maybe even a little more years, there was an annual EU-China human rights dialogue, but there was certainly some criticism within academia and within some of the EU member states. More recently, the EU has began to start applying certain sanctions to China in relation to human rights, in particular in relation to the situation in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. The EU has begun to impose sanctions, albeit of a limited nature, but again, it raises questions about the impact of these sanctions. And one of the questions which is opens up is Chinese response or counter response, in that China itself has imposed certain sanctions on the EU in response to the EU's imposition of sanctions. And then finally, within this, I want to look in more detail at this question of the externalization of Chinese authoritarianism. So this techno-authoritarianism, things like the Hong Kong national security law. So I think there's quite a kind of rich field which people are only beginning to explore, as some of these developments are really only in the last 2, 3, 4 years. And again, in 2024, we'll have a specific seminar on this issue. So, I mean, maybe, Luigi, did I cover the kind of economic and trade dimensions adequately? Thank you. So look, I'll stop there. And again, thank you very much. And thanks in particular to Dagmar for bringing us all together as well on this.
Yeah, thanks for all of you collaborating. You will have noticed that we have a little paper here. I don't know whether everybody got that. There are sort of summaries of the work package there. I think the next up is EUICR. EUICR is actually part of our project operational team, together with myself and with our research assistant, who starts anew on the 3rd of October. EUICR is also the school's communication and marketing manager. She has a degree in marketing, I think. It's down there.
Yeah.
And she's explaining.
Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly go through, I'm just going to just highlight our upcoming events. So there's a series of 10 core academic events which have been spoken about, I suppose, already. And there will be one beginning, our first one will be held this evening via Microsoft Teams on EU constitutionalism, rights and right-wing populism. So if there's anybody here or online interested and haven't signed up yet, we have an Eventbrite and you can register, and that will be beginning at 6:30 this evening. So we have events running from today up until April 2024. And we also have 4 other events as well as part of the project. So this will include, I suppose, it includes today's kickoff event, and the closing conference, and also an art exhibition which will be held in the Gluckson Gallery here in ECC. And just finally, I just want to highlight how.
Back to the citizens events. Oh, sorry. And so I was just putting in there with. So the Glucksmann, our awards-winning gallery, got an award, I think last week, isn't it?
Yeah.
Has had the idea that it would be so good to put our research results also out in a way where citizens can directly engage with them. And they've chosen work package 3 and work package 4. So when we look into anti-discrimination, like in the neighbourhood for the Glucksmann, that's experiencing anti-discrimination rights in post-colonial settings. That's one of the events where they create the opportunity of citizens to engage with our results through the medium of art. So that's also happening in relation to EU and China. I think that's quite an innovative element. Sorry.
No problem. And just how to engage. I suppose we have a web page which hosts a lot of information. Obviously, as the time goes on, there'll be more and more information. It has details about those who are involved, the work packages, news and events. So if you're interested in engaging with any of the events that were mentioned earlier, we will have details on our website. And then blogs, research papers and podcasts. So as part of the project, we will be producing a number of blog posts and podcasts as well. So they'll be hosted on the webpage. And finally, we have a social media presence as well. Our Twitter page is at JMCE UCC. So please, if you have Twitter, feel free to follow and engage with our content. So yes, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go back to the main meeting, right, to see here. Yep, and then we stop presenting.
Yes.
There you go.
The chat there as well.
Hmm?
Yeah, just bring up the chat there as well, just in case there's questions.
Oh, yes.
Come on, chat. Yep, there we go.
Okay. Well,
So,
thank you all. That was a terrific overview, and it's a very rich and it's well planned out. And you've got these events, I think I'm taken by the confidence of the presentations. You have something that's realisable and very interesting, including in cross-disciplinary ways. So we have a few minutes now for discussion or questions. Anyone like to kick off? Maybe I can.
Just something, Dagmar, when you were giving a presentation about the potential difficulties in terms of accession and accession negotiations between Ukraine and, you said particularly non-discrimination, like, what's behind that? I mean, is it a divergence in social values and economic values as well, maybe? And what does that kind of say about the Ukraine as a potential member state then?
so as far as I know, I'm trying to get Leah Fedorovka to speak at this seminar, but we will see. Ukrainians have long-term plans at the moment, and also the difficulty that they can't make long-term plans. So, anyway, she's working for a civil society organization who has criticized the anti-discrimination which has been adopted in Ukraine in the framework of the partnership agreement, which has been in fact all the time. And looking at the criticism and the English translation, I don't read Ukrainian. I mean, I can read Cyrillic, but I don't know the language. So, looking at the English translation, she has a point that those anti-discrimination rights are implemented in a very timid manner. And I think there's a combination of a civil law tradition, which has a cultural disaffinity, with anti-discrimination rights, which are imported from common law countries, such as the UK and the United States. Because for civil law countries, it's normally more natural to converse those as criminal law. And that, of course, has a problem that you have to brand the discriminator as a perpetrator, and you can't look into concepts such as indirect discrimination, structural discrimination, because then you don't have a motive, you don't have intent. So that's one issue. And the other issue is, of course, gay and lesbian rights, which are a problem in all of the Eastern neighborhood, I must say, to different degrees. That's how I know them.
Yes, indeed.
I was going to ask Andrew and Luigi just about, are you looking at the comprehensive agreement on investment as well? Because that seemed to be, you know, a good opportunity for the EU to get China to agree to some rights issues, which China appeared to be willing to accept. And obviously the whole CAI has been parked because of the tit for tat sanctions. Is that something you're going to be looking at?
Can I answer?
Please.
Yeah, the idea is precisely that was the starting idea.
Okay,
Consider
sure.
what is the leverage that the EU has when partnering with third countries, and how that economic
Sure.
leverage of the bloc results in the activation of rights for citizens in those third countries.
Yeah.
And free trade agreements, or however they are styled, international agreements entered into by the EU are certainly one of the ways to do that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add to that, I haven't looked into the detail of the CAI as it's referred to, but in terms of the politics of this, my understanding was that the point when it was signed, for various reasons around kind of geopolitics, the Chinese decided they really wanted an agreement, and they did make some concessions to the EU,
Absolutely.
which previously they haven't been willing to make. And what I don't know is whether those concessions included some commitments in the agreement on human rights that the Chinese regime might previously have viewed as unacceptable. But I think it would be interesting to maybe really get into the detail of that actually.
Yeah. Could I ask now there are two kinds of questions, both about the politics of the European Union. The recently floated idea of a European political community by Macron and others, which I think has been taken up to some extent. I mean, seriously, but that's a kind of that's going to be coinciding with your study, and it may give a way of it may present a way of getting into some of the issues about the generalizability in the neighbourhood of rights. But so I'll ask that's one question, and the second one is to do with political rights arising from EU citizenship, which include local government voting and European Parliament voting. And there has been also floated including from France, the idea of an all European or an all EU-wide voting ticket, which didn't get floated. But again, it seems to me to be relevant to the activation of political rights, but it's not something that you've identified as a research topic.
Yeah, so I think that's a question to myself, but if anybody else wants to go forwards and wants to join in, I don't mind. So first of all, with the European political community, when I read that, I had a feeling of déjà vu before the time of my birth, yeah, because it's wasn't it that European political community proposed already by France in the 1950s and then rejected by the UK of all places, which is now a staunch supporter. And so that leads me to think that the European political community of 2022 is a different kind of animal from 1952, and probably just with my UK passport, I think it might be less serious because otherwise the present government might not have supported it. So, and I haven't seen the detail, what is proposed, and I'm not sure the detail has been worked out yet. So, now, can we have the neighbourhood of rights as a European political community? So the whole idea of Macron is can be interpreted as, let's see what it comes down to add a political element to the neighbourhood. The neighbourhood policy has already a political element insofar that the EU neighbour states are supposed to implement lots of the softer policies of the EU. We have chosen anti-discrimination because of my specialization. We could have gone to ecology, consumer policy, other labour law, and all these directives need to be implemented in the neighbourhood. So it's already a political, but it's an economic political element. And I think what Macron wants to add is a statist political element, and to include voting rights for those citizens if they migrate to the EU, which aren't given at the moment. At the moment, it's just for EU citizens. So the local voting rights is a way to engage in the community, and that actually also has a very important Northern Ireland perspective, where those citizens of Northern Ireland who are Irish have been deprived of the local voting rights, yeah, which were formerly gone, but formerly based on the EU citizenship, and now it needs to be re-established. It hasn't happened yet. I don't think there's even a legislative proposal. And on the other hand, Ireland has refused to maintain the voting rights of the citizens of Northern Ireland in the European Parliament, because Ireland has a very strict voting rights. Only people who are there can vote, which is silly, yeah. And even though the Irish citizens in Northern Ireland can't be a specialty constituency. And these are issues which we have put into the project. The project only runs until 2024. And one of them aims is to create a stable cooperation between the participants and beyond. And that's also a opportunity to say we have more PIs, yeah. Not everybody's here. Mary had to go because she has to teach. It's not that she doesn't like the event. The teaching is on the other end of campus, which creates movement times. And so, that's a perfect opportunity to go into the specificities of the political neighborhood once we're done. Let's get more funding. Let's see.
Maybe add to the point about the political rights as well. Teresa Reedy, who's going to be involved in the EBI, in the Citizens Initiative, done huge amounts of work in at least voting rights in Ireland.
Yes.
The list is interesting. I mean, my sense of that is that the European Parliament is pushing quite hard for that, I think, and coming out of the Conference of the Future of Europe. So that's, you know, the Conference of the Future of Europe, I suppose, is something which is interesting as well from a immediate historical perspective.
Well, from your point of view, to look to see whether the issues that you're researching actually arose there and are salient there, they might be of interest.
Yeah, it's also for further developing further perspectives, because I hope we don't stop in 2024. Yeah.
I mean, maybe just on the European political community, I mean, my reading of that, which I think concurs with what Dagmar was saying, is that at the moment it's kind of an empty box in a sense, and we have to see whether anything substantive will be put into it. But I think it would raise lots of interesting questions about rights. You know, if something substantive happens, you know, what would the trade-offs be in terms of, you know, what would countries like Ukraine be given or offered by the EU, and the EU might ask certain rights commitments in return and so on. So I think that there would be lots of kind of interesting, important rights issues in terms of what may go into this, as I would call it, kind of current empty box of the European political community.
Yeah, but in that case, the ETC idea seems to replicate the neighbourhood policy, because the association agreements with the neighbourhood, whether they are in participation of accession or not, they already include a lot of citizens' rights which those countries have to create in exchange to getting access to the market. And they're not necessarily market related. I mean, you can say, of course, consumer protection, we need that, because otherwise there can be undercutting of production. But also other areas such as ecological rights and so on, there's a bit of a normative mission which the EU already pursues through the neighbourhood policy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't include the civil rights. I think that's probably the element which Macron wants to add. So like voting and electing and getting all pan-European lists. Some parties have already pan-European lists, right?
Yeah, sure.
That's happened. And also the Spitzenkandidat process can be seen as something in the supporting those activities of creating a common European political sphere.
Yes. Any other questions or anything from the online participants? If now's your opportunity, if you have a question.
Thanks for.
If not, are we at the point of concluding? Well, and one last opportunity to raise a question. Anybody? No. Well, if not, I'll draw this to a conclusion. We've had a marvellous overview of the planned activities, and I think a very thorough account within our time constraints of the thinking behind it. And so congratulations. I'm here as a kind of mediator, as a friendly observer, and I hope I might be able to participate in some of your activities. And the same, I'm sure, applies to our online participants. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Before we close the online meeting, can we get this document in the chat? So we, because you have it on your laptop, right?
Yeah.
Because we have, for the present people, we have the summary of what I tried to present here on paper, and you now get it as a PDF in the chat, so you have it as well. And Jen Rodda is trying to ask a question or typing something.
Just wanted to say thank you. Really interesting, thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dagmar, have you anything final to say?
Final to say, I'm eager to start now. I'm looking forward to the first event, which is on the 18th November, and you'll find registration stuff on our Twitter page. I'm really looking forward to that because it sounds quite interesting what we put together. Yeah, and I really hope that we get a proper cooperation with common publications out of this, but that's, will be an effort. And I need to thank you for making all the way from Dublin. I've learned this is like coming to Berlin from Munich, or even worse. So thank you very much for being here. And still, we also have coffees and cookies, which you have earned. Sorry for the online crowd who can't participate in that one.
Thank you.
Is it okay to close the online meeting? Yeah? Any other questions? No? All right. Thanks for coming and joining us.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.